But I really want to talk about the difference between publishing children's books and adult books, because it seems like two different worlds. I've been publishing, I think my first book was published when I was 23, and I feel like publishing has morphed and changed, but the one thing that feels the same to me is children's books, because people who are publishing children's books really care about the reader in a very deep, emotional, and yes, commercial, but commercial is not the major force. And the care that's given to the books and to the readers, I think, is so important. I have always believed that what you read between the ages of 8 and 11 is the most important reading of your life. And I think it changes you not just as a reader, but as a person. I really began reading because of the Malverne library. I lived in this netherworld. Sometimes it was called Franklin Square, sometimes it was called Hempstead, sometimes it was, I don't know what it was called, but it didn't have a library, but Malverne did. So I used to sneak over to the Malverne library, and after a while, the librarians there gave me a card and let me take out books even though I wasn't a Malverne resident. And that really changed my life. For me, the books that I read at that time, especially Edward Eger, who I think in a way, Nightbird is kind of an homage to him. He really allowed me to look for magic, even though I lived in a place that was surrounded by concrete. You know, where I grew up, every house was the same. It seemed like the least magical place in the world, but when I read Edward Eger, I had the feeling that anything could happen. One of his books, I mean, I love them all, he wrote 7 books. One of the characters says, the best sort of book is a magic book. And I grew up believing that as a reader and as a writer. You know, I think you don't choose really who you are as a writer. You're really formed by your experience as an adult, but mostly as a child and as a child reader. And I felt like magic was woven through literature. Now I know there's a lot of talk about magical realism, but for me it's always been magic, whether it's myth or fairy tales. I was kind of a fairy tale fanatic. I feel that, you know, realism is kind of the new kid on the block and a lot less believable to me. And those original magical stories started out, it's an oral tradition from grandmother to granddaughter. And my grandmother used to tell me stories about Russia and growing up in Russia. She lived in a place where the river was frozen, it seemed all year round, and she had to walk down to get water and listen to the wolves as she was running to get the water, and it just seemed like she lived in a fairy tale world, but it was her real life. I moved from Edward Eger to Ray Bradbury, who then became my literary hero and still is. I think of him as my literary father, and I know I'm not the only one. I was lucky enough to get to know him a little before he passed on. I think what he wrote about were real people and miraculous circumstances. Mostly about boys who were growing up and learning that there was evil in the world and that they had to be brave through their friendship. Again, I think Nightbird is an homage to both of these writers who I love so much. You know, people sometimes ask me what is the difference between writing for children and writing for adults, and I actually really think there is no difference. I think for me, a children's book comes to me as a children's book, just the way something will come as either a short story or a novel. I don't make the decision, it just comes to me. The only difference, I would say, in writing for children and writing for teens for me is that I feel like they're more willing to go on the journey with me, that their defenses aren't up yet, that they're more raw and more emotional and ready to believe. You know, things that we lose later on in life and in reading. And so I feel like I can go places and try things in my writing for children and teens that I wouldn't do with adults. Because for adults you have to explain everything, and children believe. And I think that, for me, is really the major difference